The first time I saw Barbara Wilson marching across my lawn with that familiar scowl on her face, I knew my peaceful Saturday morning was about to be shattered. I'd been enjoying my coffee on the porch of my home in Oak Ridge Estates, a suburban neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, when the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association decided to ruin my day. "Mr. Richardson." She called out, her voice carrying that distinctive tone of authority that made my teeth clench. "What exactly do you think you're doing with that structure in your backyard?" I sighed, setting down my coffee mug. "Good morning to you too, Barbara. That structure is my workshop." I mentioned it at the last 3 HOA meetings. Barbara Wilson had been the president of our HOA for 5 years, and in that time, she'd managed to make enemies of half the neighborhood. With her perfectly coiffed blonde bob and perpetual khaki pants, she patrolled our streets like a suburban dictator, clipboard in hand, documenting every infraction real or imagined. "Lucas Richardson," she said, climbing the steps to my porch uninvited, "I've received multiple complaints about the eyesore you're constructing. It violates at least 7 different HOA regulations." I'd moved to Oak Ridge Estates 3 years ago after my divorce. The house was perfect, a 3-bedroom colonial with a spacious backyard where I could finally build the woodworking workshop I'd always wanted. Before purchasing, I'd carefully reviewed the HOA guidelines and even submitted my workshop plans for approval. The committee had signed off on them 6 months ago. "Barbara, I have written approval from the architectural committee," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "All my permits are in order. The workshop meets all the setback requirements and height restrictions." She pursed her lips. "Well, the committee is reconsidering its decision. Several neighbors have expressed concerns about noise and property values." "Names," I demanded. "Who's complained?" She clutched her clipboard tighter. "That's confidential information, Lucas. But rest assured, the board will be discussing this at our next meeting. In the meantime, I suggest you halt construction." I stood up, towering over her 5'4" frame. At 6'2", I normally tried not to use my height to intimidate, but Barbara brought out the worst in me. "Not happening. I have approval, I have permits, and I'm continuing with my project. If the board has concerns, they can follow proper procedures." Barbara's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that. The board has ways of dealing with troublemakers, Mr. Richardson." As she stalked away, I had no idea just how prophetic her threat would prove to be. The following week, I threw myself into completing the workshop. I'd been planning this space for years, a 16x 20-foot structure with custom workbenches, storage for my growing collection of tools, and plenty of natural light from strategically placed windows. As a mechanical engineer who'd recently started doing custom furniture projects on the side, this workshop represented more than just a hobby. It was potentially a new chapter in my life. My neighbor Tom Garcia wandered over as I was installing insulation on Saturday afternoon. "Looking good, Luke," he said, handing me a beer, but I heard Barbara's on the warpath about it. I wiped sweat from my forehead and accepted the cold bottle gratefully. "Yeah, she stopped by last weekend, claims there are complaints." Tom leaned against the half-finished wall. "Bullshit. Nobody's complained. My guess is she's mad because you didn't hire her son's construction company to build it." I nearly choked on my beer. "Wait, what? Oh, you didn't know. Barbara's son runs Wilson Construction. Whenever anyone in the neighborhood wants to do a major project, she strongly suggests they use his company. Those who don't suddenly find themselves with HOA problems." That explained a lot. When I'd first submitted my plans, Barbara had given me Wilson Construction's business card, which I'd promptly tossed in the trash. I wanted to build this workshop myself, with occasional help from friends. "That's got to be illegal," I said. Tom shrugged. "Probably, but who's going to fight her? Last guy who tried ended up with so many fines he had to sell his house. Barbara's got the board wrapped around her finger." That night, I did some research. Barbara Wilson had been on the HOA board for 8 years and president for 5. During that time, there had been an unusual number of renovations and construction projects in the neighborhood, many handled by Wilson Construction. The company had mediocre reviews online, with several complaints about overcharging and poor workmanship. More concerning were the forum posts I found from former Oak Ridge residents, who claimed they'd been harassed out of the neighborhood after conflicts with the HOA. One particularly disturbing post detailed how a homeowner's approved garden shed had been deemed unauthorized after they refused to pay for expedited approval from the board. I began documenting everything. I gathered all my approvals, permits, and correspondence with the HOA. I installed security cameras around my property, focusing on the workshop area. If Barbara was planning something, I wanted evidence. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. I continued working on my workshop, which was about 80% complete. I'd installed the electrical wiring, finished the insulation, and was starting to hang drywall. My tools, many of them expensive professional-grade items I'd collected over years, were securely stored inside the nearly finished structure. Then came the certified letter. Notice of violation. Unauthorized structure, it read. The Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association has determined that the outbuilding on your property at 1428 Maple Avenue violates community guidelines. You are hereby ordered to remove the structure within 14 days or face daily fines of $100 and potential legal action. The letter was signed by Barbara Wilson and stamped with the official HOA seal. There was no mention of the previous approval or any specific violation cited. I was furious. I immediately called Jim Carlson, who served as the HOA's vice president. "Jim, it's Lucas Richardson. I just got a violation notice about my workshop, but I have written approval from the architectural committee. What's going on?" There was an uncomfortable pause on the line. "Look, Luke, there's been some reconsideration. Barbara brought up some concerns at the last meeting and the board voted to revoke your approval. You can't do that. I've already invested thousands of dollars based on your approval. That's not how contracts work." Jim sighed. "I understand your frustration, but the bylaws give the board discretion to reassess approvals if new information comes to light." "What new information?" I demanded. "Barbara presented evidence that your structure exceeds the permitted dimensions and may be being used for commercial purposes, which would violate zoning regulations." Both accusations were completely false. My workshop was exactly the size specified in my approved plans, and while I hoped to eventually sell some of my woodworking pieces, I wasn't running a business from my home. "That's completely fabricated, Jim. I can prove it. The dimensions match my approved plans exactly, and I'm not running any business." "Take it up with Barbara," Jim said wearily. "The vote's been recorded. You can appeal at the next board meeting, but that's not for 3 weeks. After hanging up, I immediately sent a certified letter to the HOA board contesting their decision and requesting an emergency meeting. I attached copies of all my documentation, including the original approval. Barbara's response came the next day, another certified letter stating that the board would consider my appeal at the regularly scheduled meeting, and until then, the violation notice stood. The 14-day clock was still ticking. I consulted a lawyer, Amanda Zimmer, who specialized in HOA disputes. "This is unfortunately common," Amanda told me in her downtown office. HOAs wield significant power and some boards abuse it. Based on what you've shown me, you have a strong case, but litigation takes time. Time I don't have if they start fining me in 2 weeks, I pointed out. Amanda nodded. I can file for an emergency injunction to prevent them from imposing fines until this is resolved legally. It'll cost you, though. I wrote the check without hesitation. Do it. And I want to countersue for harassment and any damages that result from this. We'll need evidence of malicious intent or pattern of behavior, Amanda cautioned. I'm working on that, I assured her, thinking of my ongoing research into Barbara's connections to Wilson Construction. The next day, I took a personal day from work to install additional security cameras and motion sensor lights around my property. I wasn't taking any chances. While I was at it, I moved my most expensive tools to the garage and installed a heavy-duty padlock on the workshop door. That evening, as I was reviewing the security camera setup on my computer, my doorbell rang. It was Alicia Zimmerman, a relatively new neighbor who had moved in about 6 months ago. We'd exchanged pleasantries a few times, but never really talked. "Hi, Lucas. Sorry to bother you," she said. She was in her early 30s, with long brown hair and an apologetic smile. "I heard about your trouble with the HOA and wanted to let you know I'm on your side." I invited her in, surprised by the unexpected ally. "Thanks, but how did you hear about it?" "Small neighborhood," she said with a shrug. "Plus, I was at the coffee shop this morning and overheard Barbara talking with some board members. She seemed determined. She's got it in for me because I didn't hire her son's construction company," I explained, offering Alicia a seat in my living room. Alicia nodded. "That tracks with what I've heard." She tried to push Wilson Construction on me when I wanted to redo my deck, but I'd already signed with another contractor. "Did she give you trouble afterward?" I asked. "Nothing I could prove, but I suddenly started getting notices about my landscaping and fence height." Alicia leaned forward. "Look, there's more. Barbara was talking about teaching you a lesson. I don't know exactly what she meant, but it sounded ominous." A chill ran down my spine. "Thanks for the warning. I've got cameras installed now, so if anyone tries anything." "Smart," Alicia said. "Just be careful." Barbara has friends on the police force, too. Her brother-in-law is a sergeant. After Alicia left, I double-checked all my security measures and made sure my cameras were recording properly. Then I sent an email to Amanda Zimmer, updating her on what I'd learned. 2 days later, the injunction was granted. The HOA couldn't fine me until after a court hearing scheduled for 6 weeks later. I felt a small sense of victory, but it was short-lived. The following Monday, I left for a 3-day business trip to Chicago. My company was pitching a new hydraulic system design to a major client, and as the lead engineer, I couldn't miss it. Before leaving, I checked all my security systems and asked Tom to keep an eye on my place. The meeting in Chicago went well, and we secured the contract. I was in high spirits as my flight landed back in Columbus on Thursday evening. That changed the moment I pulled into my driveway. Something was wrong. The backyard floodlights I'd left on were dark. As I got out of my car, Tom came running across the street, his face grim. "Luke, you need to see this. I tried calling you, but it went straight to voicemail. My phone had died during the flight, and I hadn't had a chance to charge it." "What happened?" "It's your workshop," Tom said, leading me around to the backyard. Where my nearly completed workshop had stood was now just an empty concrete slab. The entire structure had been demolished. Scraps of lumber and drywall were piled haphazardly on one side, but everything else, the walls, roof, windows, and worst of all, my tools, was gone. "What the hell?" I whispered, stunned. "When did this happen?" "Yesterday," Tom said. A demolition crew showed up with a backhoe and a dump truck. They had some kind of paperwork, said the structure was unauthorized and had to be removed. I tried to stop them, but they threatened to call the police if I interfered. I was in shock. But the injunction, they can't do this. I told them that, Tom said. They said they were just following orders from the city, not the HOA. I pulled out my phone, desperate to check my security footage, but the battery was still dead. The cameras, I muttered. They'll have recorded everything. Back inside, I plugged in my phone and booted up my computer to access the security system. What I saw made my blood boil. The footage from Tuesday night, around 2 a.m., clearly showed 3 people approaching my workshop. Even with their faces partially obscured by hoodies, I recognized Barbara Wilson's distinctive walk. The other 2 were men, one short and stocky, the other tall and lean. They spent nearly an hour breaking into my workshop and methodically removing my tools, loading them into what looked like Barbara's SUV. They took everything my table saw: router, planers, drills, even hand tools that had belonged to my grandfather. The following morning's footage was even more damning. A city-marked vehicle arrived, and a man in a reflective vest spoke with Barbara for several minutes. She handed him some papers, and he nodded. Hours later, the demolition crew Tom had mentioned arrived. I immediately called Amanda Zimmer. "They demolished my workshop," I nearly shouted when she answered. "And I have video of Barbara Wilson stealing my tools the night before." "Slow down, Lucas," Amanda said. "Are you certain it was her?" "Positive. And I have it all on video, her and 2 men breaking in, taking all my tools. Then the next day a city inspector shows up, talks to her, and suddenly a demolition crew tears down my workshop. This was all orchestrated by her." "Save that footage immediately," Amanda instructed. "Make multiple copies. Then call the police and report the theft. I'll handle the illegal demolition angle, but theft is a criminal matter." I followed her instructions, downloading the security footage to multiple devices and cloud storage. Then I called the police to report the burglary. 2 officers arrived within the hour. I was concerned when I learned one of them, Officer Daniels, was indeed related to Barbara by marriage, just as Alicia had warned. The other, Officer Reynolds, seemed more objective. I showed them the footage of the break-in and theft. Officer Reynolds watched with increasing concern while Officer Daniels looked uncomfortable. "That's clearly Barbara Wilson," Reynolds said, pointing to the screen. "And is that Alan Wilson, her son?" I looked more closely at the taller man. "Could be, I don't know him well." "And the demolition?" Daniels asked, sounding skeptical. "You're claiming the HOA orchestrated that too?" I played the morning footage showing Barbara with the city inspector. "That man is not from the building department," I said. "I checked with them already. No demolition permits were issued for my address. Whoever he is, he's impersonating a city official." Reynolds took detailed notes. "The theft alone is a serious crime. Based on the value of the tools you've described, we're looking at grand theft. As for the demolition, that could involve additional charges: criminal damage to property, conspiracy, possibly fraud if someone was impersonating a city official." Daniels seemed less convinced. "We'll need to verify the identity of all parties involved before making any arrests." "Of course," I agreed. "But I want to file charges immediately." Reynolds nodded. "We'll take your statement and the video evidence. I recommend you also file a report with the city about the unauthorized demolition." After the officers left, I called Amanda again, updating her on the police visit. She was already in motion, having filed an emergency motion with the court documenting the HOA's violation of the injunction. "This changes everything," she said. We're no longer just fighting an HOA overreach, we're dealing with criminal activity. I've scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. In the meantime, document everything, take photos of the demolition site, make a detailed inventory of all stolen tools with approximate values, and write down everything you remember about the timeline. I spent the rest of the evening doing exactly that, my shock gradually giving way to cold fury. The value of my stolen tools exceeded $15,000, and the workshop itself represented another $20,000 in materials and countless hours of labor. Beyond the financial loss was the violation. Barbara Wilson had crossed from bureaucratic harassment into outright criminality. The next morning, I met Amanda at the courthouse. Judge Patterson, who had granted our original injunction, looked grim as Amanda presented the new evidence. Your Honor, not only has the Oak Ridge Estates HOA violated your injunction, but its president appears to have engaged in theft and orchestrated the illegal destruction of my client's property, Amanda stated. We're asking for immediate relief and sanctions against the HOA. The HOA's lawyer, a nervous young man named Kevin Radcliffe, seemed completely unprepared. Your Honor, my clients deny any involvement in the theft or demolition. While it's unfortunate that Mr. Richardson's unauthorized structure was removed, the HOA acted within its rights to enforce community standards. Judge Patterson's eyebrows rose. Counselor, are you not aware that I issued an injunction preventing your clients from taking any action against Mr. Richardson's workshop pending our hearing? Radcliffe stuttered. My clients informed me that the demolition was carried out by city officials due to code violations, not by the HOA. I watched as Amanda played the security footage for the court. Judge Patterson's expression darkened as he watched Barbara Wilson and her accomplices stealing my tools, then coordinating with the fake city inspector. This is extremely disturbing, the judge said when the video concluded. Mr. Radcliffe, I suggest you confer with your clients immediately. Miss Zimmer, have the police been provided with this evidence? Yes, Your Honor, Amanda confirmed. A criminal investigation is underway, the judge nodded. I'm issuing an order freezing all Oak Ridge Estates HOA assets pending further investigation. Additionally, I'm ordering the immediate removal of the current board members from their positions until this matter is resolved. Mr. Richardson, the court apologizes for what you've experienced. You have my authorization to rebuild your workshop according to your originally approved plans, and the HOA is prohibited from interfering. It was a significant victory, but only the beginning. As we left the courthouse, Amanda laid out our next steps. We'll file a civil suit against the HOA and Barbara Wilson personally for damages, she explained. Given the evidence, we should be able to recover the full value of your losses, plus punitive damages. The criminal case will proceed separately. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Officer Reynolds. Mr. Richardson, we've issued arrest warrants for Barbara Wilson, Alan Wilson, and Michael Thompson, the third individual identified in your security footage. Barbara Wilson is being charged with burglary, grand theft, criminal damaging, conspiracy, and several other related offenses. The others face similar charges. I felt a mixture of vindication and exhaustion. What about the demolition crew and the fake inspector? We're still investigating, but it appears they were hired through a shell company connected to Wilson Construction. They may have believed they were performing legitimate work. The man posing as a city inspector has been identified as Robert Davis, an employee of Wilson Construction. He's also facing charges. By evening, the story had hit local news. HOA president arrested for orchestrating workshop demolition and tool theft, read the headline on the Columbus Dispatch website. The article detailed the allegations against Barbara and included quotes from several Oak Ridge residents who had experienced similar harassment. My phone wouldn't stop ringing calls from neighbors, reporters, and even a producer from a national morning show wanting to interview me about HOA horror stories. I declined most media requests, focusing instead on beginning the process of rebuilding. The following day, I received an unexpected visit from Jim Carlson and 3 other HOA board members. "Lucas, we owe you an apology," Jim said, looking genuinely remorseful. "We had no idea what Barbara was planning. We never authorized any demolition or theft. Yet you voted to revoke my approval after I'd already started building," I pointed out. "That was the first step in this whole mess." The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Barbara convinced us there were legitimate concerns," explained Margaret Fowler, the board treasurer. "She presented altered documents showing your workshop was larger than approved and claimed she had evidence of commercial activity." "And none of you bothered to verify this information?" I asked. "We trusted her," Jim admitted. "She's been president for years. We never imagined she'd fabricate evidence or break the law." "Well, now you know," I said. "And I'm not the only one she's targeted. There are at least a dozen former residents who were essentially forced out of the neighborhood through similar tactics." The board members looked stunned. Margaret spoke up again. "We want to make this right, Lucas. The remaining board members have voted to immediately approve the reconstruction of your workshop, with the HOA covering all costs. We'll also reimburse you for your tools and any legal expenses." I considered their offer. "I appreciate that, but I think the court will ultimately decide the appropriate damages. In the meantime, I suggest you all take a hard look at how the HOA has been operating and make some serious changes." After they left, Tom came over with a 6-pack. "Saw the HOA brigade leaving," he said, handing me a beer. "What did they want? To cover their asses," I replied, filling him in on their offer. Tom whistled. "They must be terrified of what else might come out during a trial. Barbara's been running this neighborhood like her personal fiefdom for years." "Well, her reign is over," I said, clinking my bottle against his. "The question is what happens next." What happened next unfolded rapidly. Barbara Wilson, her son Alan, and the other accomplices were arraigned the following day. Barbara and Alan were released on bail, but the judge ordered them to stay away from Oak Ridge Estates and have no contact with any residents, including me. The criminal case moved forward, with the prosecutor adding charges as more evidence emerged. A search of Barbara's home and Wilson Construction's offices uncovered documents suggesting a pattern of similar behavior going back years: extortion, fabricated HOA violations, and kickback schemes involving vendors and contractors working in the neighborhood. In the civil arena, Amanda filed our lawsuit seeking compensatory damages for the workshop and tools, plus punitive damages for the intentional and malicious nature of the actions. She also added a RICO claim, arguing that Barbara had essentially been running a criminal enterprise under the guise of HOA management. The media attention sparked a broader investigation. The state attorney general's office began looking into Wilson Construction's business practices and the Oak Ridge HOA's financial records. They discovered that Barbara had been skimming money from HOA dues and maintenance fees for years, funneling it to her son's company through inflated invoices for neighborhood projects. Meanwhile, I began the process of rebuilding. With the court's blessing and the HOA's forced cooperation, I obtained new permits and hired a reputable construction company, definitely not Wilson Construction, to rebuild my workshop. Insurance covered some of the losses, but the full financial recovery would depend on the outcome of the lawsuit. 3 months after the demolition, I received a surprising phone call from Detective Miller, who had taken over the case from the initial responding officers. "Mr. Richardson, we've recovered some of your stolen tools," he said. "They were found in a storage unit rented by Alan Wilson. We'll need you to come down to identify them." At the police station, I was led to a room where my tools were laid out on tables. Many of my power tools were there: the table saw, router, and drill press, though some had already been partially disassembled, presumably to make them harder to identify. Missing were most of my hand tools, including my grandfather's antique planes and chisels, which had the most personal value to me. "This is about 60% of what was stolen," I told Detective Miller. "The most valuable items monetarily, but not everything." Miller nodded, making notes. "We'll keep looking. Alan Wilson is now cooperating with our investigation in exchange for leniency. He's implicated his mother as the mastermind behind not only your case, but numerous other incidents." This news was both satisfying and disturbing. How many other homeowners did they target? "We've identified at least 17 cases over the past 6 years, where Barbara Wilson appears to have used her position to harass homeowners who refused to use Wilson Construction, or otherwise crossed her. In several cases, she engineered HOA violations that resulted in significant fines or even forced sales." "She should go to prison," I said firmly. "That's looking increasingly likely," Miller agreed. "The prosecutor is building a strong case. With the physical evidence, your video footage, and now Alan's testimony, Barbara Wilson is facing serious jail time." 6 months after the demolition, my new workshop was finally completed. It was nearly identical to the original design, though I'd made a few improvements based on lessons learned. More importantly, it was built with proper permits, approvals, and the blessing of the newly reformed HOA board. The day after the workshop was finished, I hosted a neighborhood open house. Nearly 30 neighbors came to see the structure and hear about my ordeal. Among them was Alicia Zimmerman, who had become a good friend through this process. "It's beautiful, Lucas," she said, admiring the finished space. "Even better than the original." "Thanks for your support through all this," I told her. "If you hadn't warned me about Barbara's threats, I might not have installed those security cameras," she smiled. "I'm just glad something good came from this mess. The neighborhood feels different now in a good way. People are actually talking to each other instead of just worrying about getting violation notices." It was true. With Barbara gone and a more reasonable board in place, the atmosphere in Oak Ridge Estates had changed dramatically. Neighbors were organizing community events, helping each other with projects, and generally behaving like a community rather than adversaries. The criminal trial began 8 months after the incident. I was called as the primary witness, along with several other homeowners who had experienced similar harassment. The evidence was overwhelming: security footage, financial records, testimony from Alan Wilson and other accomplices, and a paper trail of falsified documents and fraudulent HOA actions. Barbara Wilson maintained her innocence throughout, claiming she was being framed by disgruntled homeowners who resented her enforcement of necessary community standards. Her attorney tried to paint her as a dedicated volunteer being persecuted for doing an unpopular job. The jury didn't buy it. After just 6 hours of deliberation, they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts: burglary, grand theft, criminal damaging, conspiracy, fraud, and misuse of HOA funds. The judge, citing the premeditated nature of the crimes and the abusive position, sentenced Barbara to 8 years in prison and ordered her to pay restitution to all victims, including me. Alan Wilson received a lesser sentence of 3 years in exchange for his cooperation. Robert Davis, the fake city inspector, got 18 months. The third accomplice, Michael Thompson, Barbara's brother-in-law, received 2 years probation after testifying against the others. The civil case settled shortly after the criminal convictions. The HOA's insurance company agreed to pay $75,000 to cover my losses and legal expenses. Barbara was ordered to pay an additional $100,000 in punitive damages, though collecting that money would likely take years given her new residence in state prison. Wilson Construction lost its business license and filed for bankruptcy amid mounting legal problems and client lawsuits. The state attorney general's investigation resulted in additional charges against both Barbara and Alan for tax evasion and business fraud. 1 year after the demolition, I was finally able to use my new workshop for its intended purpose. My first project was a memorial plaque for my grandfather, crafted from walnuts salvaged from the original workshop debris. It wasn't the same as having his tools, but it felt like an appropriate way to honor his memory and mark my own journey through this ordeal. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA underwent a complete transformation. New bylaws were adopted that limited board power, required transparency in all decisions, and established clear appeal procedures for homeowners. Quarterly financial audits became mandatory, and all vendor contracts had to be competitively bid. Most importantly, a new culture developed that emphasized community support rather than punitive enforcement. I eventually joined the Architectural Review Committee, using my experience to ensure that homeowners' projects were evaluated fairly and consistently. When new residents moved in, I made a point of welcoming them personally and explaining the HOA's reformed approach. 18 months after the incident, as I was working in my workshop on a coffee table commissioned by a local restaurant, Alicia stopped by with iced tea. "You've got to see this," she said, showing me her phone. On the screen was an article from a national magazine about HOA reform, featuring Oak Ridge Estates as a case study in how communities can recover from corrupt leadership. "From horror story to success story," I remarked, reading the headline. "All because you stood your ground," Alicia said. "If you hadn't fought back, Barbara would still be terrorizing this neighborhood." I shook my head. I just wanted to build a workshop. I never expected to become the poster child for HOA resistance. "Sometimes the most important fights are the ones we don't choose," she replied. "By the way, the Neighborhood Picnic Committee wants to know if you'll make some of those wooden serving boards again this year." "They were a hit last summer." I smiled. "I'd be happy to. It's nice to use my tools for the community instead of fighting with it." 2 years after my workshop was demolished, the neighborhood held a celebration marking the official end of all legal proceedings related to the Barbara Wilson era. The event, held in our community park, drew nearly every resident. Tables were set up with food and drinks, children played on the newly renovated playground equipment, and there was a genuine sense of community that had been missing for years. Jim Carlson, who had stepped up as interim HOA president during the crisis and helped guide the reforms, made a short speech thanking everyone who had worked to rebuild the community. To my surprise, he called me up and presented me with a plaque recognizing my courage in standing up to corruption and commitment to positive change. As I looked out at my neighbors, Tom Garcia, who had supported me from the beginning, Alicia, who had warned me about Barbara's threats, and dozens of others who had shared their own stories of HOA abuse, I felt a sense of closure. I never wanted to be in a battle with the HOA, I told the crowd. I just wanted to build something with my own hands and pursue my passion for woodworking. What I discovered through this ordeal is that communities, like workshops, need to be built on a solid foundation of trust, transparency, and mutual respect. I'm proud of what we've all built together here in Oak Ridge Estates, and I look forward to many more years as your neighbor and friend. The applause was genuine, and as I rejoined the crowd, several people approached to share their own stories or ask for advice about projects they were considering. The fear that had once permeated discussions about home improvements had been replaced with enthusiasm and creativity. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, I walked home with Alicia, who had become more than just a neighbor and ally through this process. "What's next for the neighborhood handyman?" she asked as we reached my driveway. I looked back at my workshop, now illuminated by the security lights I'd kept installed as a precaution, but no longer feared would be needed. "I'm thinking of scaling back my engineering hours and taking on more furniture commissions," I said. The restaurant coffee tables led to 3 more orders, and I've got a waiting list for custom dining tables. "So Barbara Wilson accidentally helped you launch a new career," Alicia observed with a smile. I laughed. "I suppose there's irony in that, though I could have done without the drama and legal battles." "The neighborhood is better for it," Alicia said, "and so are you in a way." "You found your voice." She was right. Before the workshop incident, I had been a relatively quiet resident, attending HOA meetings occasionally but rarely speaking up. The ordeal had forced me to advocate for myself, connect with neighbors, and help create positive change. The following weekend, as I worked in my shop on a custom dining table, I reflected on how much had changed in 2 years. The workshop that Barbara Wilson had tried to destroy had become not just a place for my woodworking, but a symbol of resilience for the entire community. Neighbors occasionally stopped by to see what I was working on or ask for advice on their own projects. The tools recovered from the storage unit had been returned to me and were once again being used for their intended purpose. Though I still missed my grandfather's hand tools, I'd come to terms with their loss and focused instead on the legacy of craftsmanship he had instilled in me. Barbara Wilson remained in prison, her appeals having been denied. According to the local paper, she maintained her innocence and blamed a conspiracy of ungrateful homeowners for her downfall. Few in the neighborhood gave her claims any credence. The story of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA transformation spread beyond our community. I occasionally received emails from homeowners in other cities facing similar situations, asking for advice on how to fight back against abusive boards. I always emphasized the importance of documentation, knowing your legal rights, and building alliances with neighbors. 3 years after the demolition, I was elected to the HOA board myself, something I never would have imagined wanting previously. My platform was simple: maintain the reforms we'd implemented, continue improving transparency, and focus on enhancing the community rather than policing it. My first official act as a board member was to propose a neighborhood workshop program where residents could learn basic woodworking skills in my shop. The classes quickly became popular, especially among new homeowners wanting to tackle DIY projects. In a fitting conclusion to the saga, the final payment of Barbara Wilson's court-ordered restitution arrived exactly 3 years and 6 months after my workshop was demolished. I used the money to establish a neighborhood improvement fund, which provided matching grants for residents undertaking projects that benefited the community garden spaces, little free libraries, and even a small playground improvement. The workshop that had once been at the center of so much conflict had become a gathering place and a source of community pride. The tools that Barbara Wilson had stolen in the dead of night were now regularly used to teach neighbors new skills and help them create things for their homes. Looking back, I realized that what Barbara had failed to understand was that a community isn't defined by rigid rules and property values. It's built on relationships, mutual respect, and shared purpose. In trying to tear down what I was building, she had inadvertently helped create something much stronger than a wooden structure in my backyard. My workshop stood as a daily reminder that standing up for what's right, even against seemingly insurmountable opposition, can lead to positive change far beyond what we initially imagine. And every time I turned on the lights and picked up my tools, I felt a sense of victory not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever faced the tyranny of unchecked power and found the courage to say, "Enough." The security cameras that had captured Barbara's crimes remained installed, though they had never again recorded anything more threatening than a curious raccoon. They served as a quiet reminder that vigilance is the price of freedom, even in the seemingly benign context of suburban America. But more importantly, they reminded me that sometimes the most powerful tool we have isn't made of wood or steel, but of truth clearly documented and boldly presented when it matters most.